Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us online today for Friday Focus. Friday Focus is an online talk series which is hosted by the Hunterian, and we are the museum and art gallery at the University of Glasgow. In each edition of these talks, we'll hear from a different speaker covering a different topic, and we tend to look at our exhibitions and displays that are happening across our venues, as well as research that goes on at the Hunterian and across the University of Glasgow, and all the exciting work and research that goes on behind the scenes with our collections. So today I'm really pleased to be joined by Samuel Riley, who is going to be talking to us today about works in the Hunterian collection by master Yoruba woodcarver Lamidi Olonade Fakeye and his apprentices. Sam is an AHRC funded doctoral researcher based at the University of St Andrews. The AHRC is the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Sam's research considers how global attitudes towards Nigerian art were transformed in the decades after Nigerian independence in 1960. And the particular focus of his research is the archive of Professor Frank Willett, which is held at the University of Glasgow. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Sam's going to give us a bit of a presentation, and then there'll be some time at the end for any questions that you might have. And you can pop them in the chat by clicking at the speech bubble at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to those at the end. So I'll hand over to Sam now to deliver today's talk.
Thank you very much, Eleni, and thanks everyone for joining. So yes, we are talking today about the Nigerian woodcarver, who you can see here in full flow, Lamidi Olonade Fakeye, and in particular this ibeji or twin figure, which you can see here on the right, which is in the collections of the Hunterian. And the title of this talk comes from a quotation from Lamidi himself. And among the many ways in which this artist engaged the question of modernity in his work is by publishing an autobiography. And I'd be thrilled if anyone was able to correct me on this, but I think I'm right in saying that this book from 1996 is probably the only instance of a long form published account of the life and work of a West African woodcarver operating in the traditions handed down to him by his ancestors that's been written in their own words. And so I wanted to kick us off with one of countless wonderful anecdotes from this book, which particularly concerns Lamidi's first ever solo exhibition held at the British Council in Ibadan in March 1960, which was, of course, a time when the whole of Nigeria was gearing up to celebrate its independence from the British Empire later that year. So Lamidi, by his own admission, was pretty blasé about this exhibition. He writes, "I was not serious and did not think it too important." And he arrived on the day of the show only to be berated by the director of the British Council. You are stupid. You don't value your work. You don't respect your work. When Lamidi asked what on earth he'd done wrong, he was told, "The governor is coming today, and you're dressed like this. You must be in fine dress." So he had to run home and change, and he was still wondering what all the fuss was about. But by the end of that evening, when he was sitting in a swanky hotel watching himself on television, with the last colonial Governor General James Robertson praising his work in front of an admiring and applauding audience, the significance had really begun to dawn on him. So as such, events of 1960 were really a watershed moment for Lamidi Fakeye, as they were, of course, for Nigeria at large. Before long, he had embarked on scholarships at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and with the British Council in London, as well as extensive tours of the United States. In 1978, he settled back in Nigeria as a fellow at what was then the University of Ife, now Obafemi Awolowo University, where he completed some of his most important commissions, including this enormous carving of Oduduwa, the Yoruba creation god, which stands, if you were wondering, at some 14 feet and took him a decade to complete. He would continue for the rest of his life to travel widely throughout the United States, serving spells as artist in residence at institutions from Michigan to Massachusetts to Chicago, and to complete his autobiography. And by the time he died in 2009, he was designated a living world treasure by UNESCO. So I think it's interesting to get a sense of this kind of international, global profile, really, he enjoyed, which in many ways was unprecedented for an artist of his kind that we might put into the bracket of a more traditional Yoruba artist. But despite his fame in Nigeria and America, Lamidi is very little represented in UK museum collections. There are three works in the University of Birmingham, all of which are currently on loan to the blockbuster exhibition on Nigerian modernism, which has just opened at Tate Modern in London. And one of these is the work that you can see on the right here. And then at the Hunterian, there is this wonderful ibeji or twin figure that he carved in 1959, which is, of course, when he was right on the cusp of departing for pastures new. And as well as the ibeji by Lamidi, the Hunterian also owns three more ibeji that were carved by his apprentices at exactly the same time. So we have two younger brothers, Joseph and Ganayu, and a third sculptor named Amasu Akande. And these four pieces comprise, in and of themselves, a really exceptional, though perhaps not used often enough, opportunity to study Yoruba woodcarving, really on the eve of the post-colonial era. And what I want to do today is spend a bit of time considering the sculptures closely in themselves, as well as considering the story of and the significance behind their having ended up here in Glasgow at the Hunterian. First of all, though, I think it's important to place these in the context of Lamidi's early career and the tradition of Yoruba woodcarving more broadly. So on this, I think the overarching impression I want to impart of Lamidi's early education as a sculptor is that he ended up with a training that probably wasn't a million miles away from the very traditional apprenticeship of a Yoruba woodcarver, but he arrived at it by a rather non-traditional route. Shaped, that is, by a whole host of what we might call modern forces, at the forefront of which are, of course, the latter stages of British colonialism and the shift to an independent Nigeria. Lamidi was born in 1928 in Ilo Orangun, an ancient Yoruba city in what is now Osun State, so we're in southwestern Nigeria here, to a line of woodcarvers that stretched back 5 generations. A pivotal moment in his life, he recounts, happened at the age of 10 in 1938, when Lamidi remembers trying his hand at carving for the first time. He sort of sequestered himself from his relatives and remembers sort of sitting under the boughs of a tree, carving away at an ibeji figure. And soon a small group had gathered around him and began shouting, and at first he thought he was in trouble. But then he realized they were exclaiming in unison, "You are acting according to your middle name, Olonade, which means in Yoruba, the carver has come." So shortly after, Lamidi began assisting his father and his older brother in their workshop, learning the use of traditional local tools and techniques, which we'll go into a little more later. By 1945, so he's still quite young, both of Lamidi's parents had died and he was cast on his own devices. By a circuitous route, Lamidi called it fate. While searching for an education for himself, he came into contact with George Bamidele Ariogun, who happened to be the son of really his idol as a carver, Ariogun of Oshi. And at this time, George Bamidele was really the star figure in the workshop of one Father Kevin Carroll, who is an important figure. He was a Liverpool-born Irish Catholic priest and missionary in the town of Oye-Ekiti. Lamidi impressed Carroll, and so he won his chance to be apprenticed to George Bamidele. There's not really time here to go into the kind of, enormous, though conflicted legacy of Carroll's time in Nigeria, but we can say that Lamidi's reflections on his relationship with Father Carroll throughout his life are very positive, although, complicated. Lamidi was, throughout his life, a devout and practicing Muslim, so he was now training under a Catholic priest in the production of a form of carving that was inextricably linked to the traditional Yoruba pantheon of gods. Lamidi avows that this kind of interfaith existence was common in his youth, where woodcarvers among his family would diversely choose to follow Islam, Christianity, or traditional religion, and they'd, be doing this while living together in the same compounds. Lamidi quite humorously suggests that Carroll never talked to me about my religion as a Muslim or about his religion as a priest of Christianity, and that is one reason why we were so close to one another. But he also writes that throughout his life, whenever he thought of his own father, immediately I remember Father Carroll as well, and he thanks God for it. So Lamidi was trained by George Bamidele under Kevin Carroll's eye, predominantly in the production of large-scale permanent works, so in the Yoruba style, but generally commissions for Roman Catholic settings throughout the region. You can see here George Bamidele's sort of detail from a larger door showing a biblical scene. In 1954, missionary politics essentially caused the disbanding and the defunding of the Oye-Ekiti workshop. And so Lamidi began this period of about 5 years or so, traveling through Yoruba land and completing some serious commissions of his own for the Catholic Church. You can see here this wonderful set of double doors for St. Mary's and Ibadan, with a whole host of scenes. And then on the left, this is the first work apparently that he completed for Kevin Carroll's workshop. This veranda post. Now, during the course of his peregrinations, he came to the attention of the British Council in Ibadan, who approached him about preparing his pivotal one-man show in 1960, which is where we began today. And it is also at exactly this time, while Lamidi was preparing for this show and had just established his own workshop, that he was paid a visit by one Frank Willett, at the time a young British archaeologist in the region, who would go on to become, one of the more significant experts on Nigerian art history of his generation. And Willett was fascinated to find in Lamidi's workshop around 50 to 60 of these ibeji carved by him and his four apprentices, responding to the example Lamidi himself had carved. And so, of course, he bought the four examples, including the one by Lamidi the master, which I showed at the start. He also at this time bought from Lamidi a large-scale Ipa mask, so mask for the Ipa masquerade you can see in the photo here with these kind of elaborate superstructures over the helmet mask. And there's a brilliant tale about this one, which Lamidi tells in his autobiography. So while Willett was still out in Nigeria in the early 1960s, he was driving along a rural stretch of road when his car hit an oil slick and careened off the road. And it was a horrible accident, and Willett broke his leg. And the story goes that his wife, Connie, would certainly have broken her neck were it not for the fact that this large wooden mask was lying down beside her in the seat. And Lamidi says that this impeded the forward progress of her seat during the accident. And I've also managed to dig out this brilliant photo of Lamidi with Willett's youngest daughter, who I think would have been about 10 at this time, but this is in 1972. In 1976, Willett arrived in Glasgow to become the first professional director of the Hunterian. Essentially, before that, the post was filled by academics who would take it on a kind of voluntary basis for a year or two. So what that means is that he was the first to have a salaried long-term position as the head of the museum and the art gallery. And among many other achievements, including overseeing the opening of the art gallery and the Mackintosh House. He did quite a lot to bolster its holdings of African art, and particularly really 20th century African art, which is one of the key broader subjects of what I'm looking at in my PhD. When he died in 2006, he bequeathed a lot of the stuff that he hadn't bought with the museum to the museum, further bolstering its collections, and that was how the museum came to acquire the four ibeji, which we'll go on to discuss. So I hope that the picture we're really beginning to build up here is that with Lamidi, we've got this incredibly rich amount of biographical and indeed autobiographical material that really helps us to engage with his works in quite an intimate way. And what we also have is an enormous amount of documentation of how precisely Lamidi worked, and in his own voice and in those of others, including Willett. So what I want to sort of do with the second half of this presentation is really to take a close look at the ibeji through the eyes of both Lamidi and of Frank Willett, and get a sense of some of the processes that went into them. And I want then to finish with a brief reflection on some of the broader questions that these works raise about tradition and modernity in Nigerian art of the 20th century. So coming back to the title. So the first port of call for those who don't know is really to go into what is an ibeji. Ibeji is sort of one of the key genres of freestanding, smaller Yoruba sculptures. The example by Lamidi is about 30 centimeters. And they were figures that were traditionally commissioned after the death of a twin. The Yoruba famously have perhaps the highest, certainly one of the highest incidences of twin birth worldwide, about 4 times the global average. And there's this elaborate mythology pertaining to twins who are presumed, for instance, to have supernatural powers, to be protected by Shango, the thunder god. And if one dies, then their likeness, the carved ibeji figure, would in traditional times have been clothed, fed, and otherwise cared for by the mother because it was believed to house the spirit of the departed. So alongside Lamidi's carving here, I'm showing 2 more by very significant, slightly earlier Yoruba carvers, so Ariogan of Oshi we mentioned earlier, and Bamigboye. And it's clear that although these are really immediately recognizable as ibeji, they've got an awful lot in common. You can also begin to see how really skilled carvers use the genre to sort of exhibit their particular style. So Lamidi's got these kind of pretty rounded forms. Ariogan's are much more angular. You look at the eyes, the noses, the headdresses across, and there really are kind of quite distinctive details that they're pretty different. So this is important to sort of think about when we get into looking at the works by the apprentices. But before that, a word on process. So what I'm showing here alongside back view now of the Hunterian's ibeji is a page from Lamidi's autobiography, which details the 5 stages of traditional Yoruba woodcarving. Most previous Western writers had only identified 4, but Lamidi points to this initial stage, Sisa, in which the very rough form is outlined using an adze. And the second stage, Onalile, is completed with an adze and chisels. Of it, Lamidi writes, "It can take some time to know how to balance a particular type of figure, and it is this balance that should be apparent by the end of Onalile." Stages 3 and 4, you're sort of moving into using chisels and knives for the first time. These are called Alatunle and Didan, and in them the figure, as you can see, becomes more and more elaborated. And then at last you have stage 5, Fin, in which the fine details and the kind of surface texture are completed with the finest implements. And Lamidi actually also mentions a unique 6th stage that only pertains to ibeji figures. This is called Ila, and these are the scarifications on the face. If you just go back, these kind of facial markings, which were supposed to be the same as the father of the twins. Okay, so these images we're looking at here were produced by Willett just before he came to the Hunterian in 1973, and at this time he was an academic at Northwestern University in Illinois near Chicago. And this just happened to coincide with Lamidi's kind of extensive period of traveling around the States. So the 2 of them, having met in Nigeria, came into contact with each other again in America. And so in 1973, Willett invited Lamidi to Northwestern so that the 2 of them could videotape the entire construction of a single small work, this sort of Madonna and child figure, or mother and child figure, from start to finish. So the whole process took about 13 hours. And in his archives in Glasgow, there's there is the videotape itself, which sadly I'm not able to show because it involves quite a complicated digitization process, which I hope is underway, or the archives team are looking into it. But we do have the stills. Um, and we also have the documentation of kind of the analysis of what it meant to be able to go back and keep watching a carver at work in this process. And some of these insights are really interesting. For instance, that from start to finish, Lamidi would use about 40 cutting implements, ranging from adzes for the initial stages to this kind of whole host of chisels and knives of different fineness, just to get to move towards finer and finer elaboration and detail throughout. And then, the special remark that comes from having watched the process is really the essentially rhythmic nature of the process. And from that kind of comes the observation that obviously you look at Yoruba sculpture and symmetry is key, but this is just as much a feature of the process of carving as it is of the finished work itself. So at this stage, let's bring back the all of the ibeji, including the works by Lamidi's apprentices. With what's really interesting about smaller works like ibeji is that the apprentices were entrusted to complete the entire work themselves. So for larger commissions, doors and veranda posts, what would tend to happen is that the apprentices would undertake the initial stages of carving, and then the master would step in for fin to kind of do the final details and flourishes. But with these examples, what you can see is how these, burgeoning young artists set the challenge of emulating a standalone piece by a master, tried to really distinguish themselves and stamp their own style on it. So in terms of the points of what's in common, and this is Willett's photo at the bottom, and it's really good for kind of being able to see, relative heights, and they're sort of slightly in profile. So you can, looking at this, you can see that they've got this kind of chin dimple, this sort of vertical line going from the lower lip to the bottom of the chin, which is Lamidi all over. That's very, very characteristic of certainly this stage of his production. They've also all got pretty similar ears. But where you can really sort of see the differences in the faces, the apprentices are much more scrunched up. Lamidi's got this kind of elongated effect that sort of segues beautifully into the headdress, so that it all appears as this kind of uninterrupted oval. Other comments. The one in the middle is the one by Amasu Akande is the only one that really has tried to replicate the neck charms. And what all of this kind of comparison and difference shows in one respect, as Willett writes, is that even within an apprenticeship system, the young sculptor is not required to copy his master's work slavishly. They've got a bit of, they've got a fair amount of free rein to explore their own ideas. They've all departed to greater or lesser extents from the example. But also what is clear is that the symmetry of Lamidi's example is greater, and certainly the kind of the details accomplished during fin are much they show much greater experience at that stage of the process. So I now want to really come to a close by looking at something a little bit different and showing the ibeji next to a painting by the Nigerian modernist painter Damas Nwoko, titled Nigeria in 1959. And I didn't know this before going to the Tate show, actually, in London. But it's a highlight there. And I do, if you can get to London, it's a great exhibition to go and see. And so what you're looking at in this painting is, Damas and Morocco had this kind of comic flair, and here you've got these fatigued, drawn-out colonial officers, and behind them are sort of gathering the Nigerians who, until this moment, have really been, confined to the shadows, and they're now sort of poised to take over. And it's been described as one of the more powerful commentaries on the exact moment of Nigerian independence. But the moment it depicts is also, of course, the one in which Lamidi was carving this ibeji. And so I wanted to reflect on really what we mean by tradition and modernity when we talk about art in general, and certainly West African art. A final anecdote from Lamidi's autobiography runs that in 1962, Lamidi arrived at the British Museum expecting to be welcomed by the curator and have a tour of the museum and to have a bit of time chatting. He'd met the curator William Fagg out in Nigeria previously, but instead he was sort of given fairly short shrift about a 10-minute fairly perfunctory meeting. And he was later questioned, why have you come to London when you are not a modern artist? Um, which I think really stung him, or he certainly says that it hurt in the autobiography. And in some respects, I think is something or an impression that he always wanted to fight against. Um, and I think I want to leave by posing the question that's raised by having these two contemporaries of each other, works produced at the same time in Nigeria side by side. And what really do we mean by a modern artist? The academic Will Ray makes the point that even Yoruba carvers of the generations who came before Lamidi, such as Ariogan of Oshi, people we very, very much tend to put in the traditional camp, were themselves responding to and sometimes commenting on circumstances that were bang up to date in their day, including the formalization of empire across Nigeria. And yet, I think that a lot of people would still tend to look at the work on the left and think instinctively that it belongs to an earlier moment than that of the work on the right. And yet, Lamidi continued his art deep into the 20th century. He didn't die until 2009. And so it feels important to me to go back to works like this at the Hunterian, to consider them closely, but also to consider them in the context of their very enthralling historical moments. So yeah, that is brings us to a close. Thank you very much for listening. I'll hand back to Eleni.
Thank you so much, Sam. If anyone's got any questions, you can pop them in the chat. It must be an absolute treat and a gift as a researcher to have access to such an extensive archive. And you did mention that Frank Willett first met Lamidi in Nigeria, but I don't know if you touched on it exactly as to like how, or if he was aware of Lamidi before first seeing him in Nigeria.
Um, I think, yeah, I think Lamidi was pretty famous across Nigeria by then, and certainly Willett was himself a Catholic and was friendly with Father Carroll. So I would need to absolutely double check, but I'm pretty sure that he would have been notified of the fact that Lamidi was around by Kevin Carroll, and that a meeting might have even been arranged by him. So I think it was through those kinds of networks that he came into contact with him.
And we looked at some of the work of his apprentices, and I just wondered, in your research, if you have had access to living artists today that have worked under Lamidi, or if there's any kind of like record of experiences of those artists that were his
Yeah,
apprentices.
so certainly I mean, he's this enormous figure in Nigeria, and his family are kind of still keeping his torch aflame, and are continuing to sort of, some of them are themselves carvers. I think at this, and I would love to make connections with people in Nigeria to that effect. In terms of living artists, yeah, I mean, there are reports, sadly, that the skill is, there are constantly reports coming out that the skill is getting practiced less and less, but then there are always people who are kind of continuing to keep it alive and to reform it as well. I mean, one of the things that I didn't get much of a chance to talk about was the way that as Lamidi's career went on, he became, he did adapt, and his style changed, and he became less symmetrical, and his sculptures had a greater element of movement. So he sort of, there are really interesting connections between him and kind of later modern works. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. There is something in the chat just from Lola. It's not a question, but she's just referencing that In 2022, Dr. Hannah L. Clark organised a global history hackathon of Frank Willett's collections that included international participation and Yoruba representatives. Lola took part in this and it was really interesting. And she's just suggested that maybe that's interesting for your research to get in touch with Dr. Clark if you want.
That's amazing. Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating to hear of, and yeah, I'll jump on that. Thank you.
And there's a question here from Shan, which says, do carvers traditionally use particular timbers?
Yeah, so that I mean that's a huge subject. Yes, there are different kinds of wood that have particular kinds of uses. What the Iroko tree is kind of called like the king of trees, and it's this very hard, durable wood that would be used for like secure doors for compounds that you don't want anybody breaking into, but also for works that you want to last for a very long time. Ibeji are carved from a kind of wood called ire, which is slightly softer and easier to carve and more, but also still durable. Let me, there's an interesting sort of little fact about the way that Lamidi kind of modernized his practice as well here, and that where older carvers would have felled the trees themselves and then sort of kept them for 2 years, 3 years to weather. Lamidi sort of eventually struck up this kind of working relationship with local lumber yards where he would just sort of pick what he wanted, and they'd already been kind of lying out for this kind of industrial purposes. So he would sort of work his way. That was how he worked in his later life. But yeah, the subject of kind of types of wood and Yoruba carving is enormous. Yeah.
And just finally, since we were talking about types of wood, I wondered if maybe you could talk a bit about like the particular tools that you used in Yoruba wood carving.
Yeah. So I spoke a bit, but and an adze is a kind of axe, I suppose. So you if we go back to this slide, you can see the kind of really rough forms hewn out, and then you would move into to a series of chisels, and then the knives were, a combination of European imports, but also traditional knives that had been, fashioned in West Africa for centuries. There's a whole host of stuff. I mean, I think I said that he used about 40 different tools. So, there's every kind of, you think about a painter in his box of paintbrushes with all of them having these very, very fine gradations of use, and you're kind of in the same ballpark.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sam, and thank you everyone for joining us online today. A recording of this talk will be made available on our YouTube channel soon, and our next talk will be in 2 weeks' time, I think, on the 14th of November. Thanks again, Sam.
Thank you. Cheers.